So I'm going to try to talk today about how people learned Latin in antiquity. Of course, some people grew up speaking Latin, but many people grew up speaking Greek, and they had to learn Latin just the way we learn a foreign language. So what I want to look at is, first of all, how did they do it? How did you learn a foreign language in the ancient world? And secondly, how do we know? How can we reconstruct that process? Well, to take the second question first, we have two kinds of information on how they learned languages. We have some pieces of actual notes and books from ancient schools which survive. They're very small pieces. I'm going to show some of them later. They're just little scraps, but we have quite a lot of them. Also, we have some intact textbooks, things that people use to learn languages that survive intact. And they survive intact the same way that other ancient texts survive intact, by being transcribed in medieval manuscripts. Elena, there are some more copies. Elena, there are some more copies of the handout there if you are out. And these textbooks are called the Hermenumeta Pseudo-Dositheana. Now that's quite a weird title, but the books are actually much more fun than that title makes it sound, because they are very much like a modern textbook. If I am learning Russian, for example, I might get a textbook where people go to Moscow or St. Petersburg and they do the kind of things that one does in Moscow or St. Petersburg. And so I don't just learn the Russian language, I also learn about Russian culture. And the same is true in antiquity. You have, if you look at passage 1 on the handout, you have a story about somebody, now let's see, will this work? Yes, which you find in this manuscript, about somebody who goes to the bank in Rome and he borrows money. And it talks you through exactly how you borrow money in Rome. Now I just want to look for a moment at how this text works. So I know you can't read that one, but I've blown up the beginning of the passage that is on the handout, and you'll see that it doesn't look quite the same on the handout as it does on the slide, and that's because the handout is an edition. So that's a cleaned up version of what's in the manuscripts. And you can see that the Greek in particular has suffered greatly. That is a 12th century manuscript. And by the 12th century, Greek that's being transmitted in Western Europe does not look very Greek. So you might not want to look at the Greek. If you know any Greek, look at the handout. But the two columns say the same thing, because the way these texts work is they are bilingual, and every line says the same thing. So you have the Latin and the Greek in each line saying the same thing. And then on my handout, I have tried to render that in English. So the third column is my English translation, and you'll see it doesn't always work, because English is a language with very fixed word order. I couldn't always make the English fit the Latin and the Greek. The fourth column was done by a graduate student at my university in England, Elena Czepel, and she has made it work because Russian has more flexible word order. So you can do this with Latin, you could do it with Greek, you could do it with Russian. English is the language where it's harder. You'll also see in those third and fourth columns that Elena and I have added in the indication of who is speaking. And that's not there in the original, because in antiquity, you don't say in a written text who is speaking. That is part of the reader's job to work out. It's not the writer's job to tell you. That's true of these texts. It's also true of the great classical Greek drama. So Sophocles, Euripides, Aristophanes, and Plautus, those people wrote without telling you who was saying what. It was up to the reader of those texts to work out who's supposed to be saying what. But we're not used to doing that, so I've put the speaker designations in. So if you look a bit more at the content, you'll see we get a very polite and helpful banker, and you get all the different steps in this transaction. So you have a loan contract. If you're borrowing money, you have to put your seal. You don't sign it, you seal it with your sealing ring. You count the money you're receiving, and you check it over to see if there's any bad coinage. There's a lot of bad coinage in the Roman Empire, and the banker doesn't want you coming back tomorrow saying, hey, here's this bad coin, you gave it to me, take it back and give me a better one, because of course you might have got it somewhere else. So the banker wants you to check before you leave the bank and agree that all of it's good coins. And also, of course, wants you to bring it back when you return it in good coins. Now, this sort of daily life dialogue is not the only kind of thing that you might get in an ancient textbook. You also have this kind of dialogue. This is passage 2 on the handout. This is a story about a boy who goes to school and learns Latin. And again, it takes you through what he does. So this is an earlier manuscript than the previous one, and you can see the Greek is in better condition. The Greek is in Greek script, but there is a problem with that manuscript as well. The Latin and the Greek are one line off. So if you look at that right-hand column, the first word, salutem, is not on your handout. The first line of passage 2 on the handout is that and that. And then the second line is that and that. Then that goes with the first half of this line, and that goes with the second half. Because when he got to the bottom of the column, the writer realized that he'd gotten one line ahead in the Latin, and he squishes the extra Latin line in. Now we're at the top of the next column, and you'll see that for a while everything is fine. He gets the alignment right. And then he gets there. Now that's a hole. That hole was there already when the writer was writing, so he just skipped over it. He skips 2 lines in the Greek and goes on. And then when he's writing the Latin column, he should have skipped 2 lines in the Latin too, but he forgot. So the Latin column is then 2 lines off the Greek, all the way down to the very bottom of that extract, where you'll see those 2 extra lines in the Latin that are not on the handout. So looking at what it says, it's a boy who goes to school, he wants to learn to speak Latin, not to read Latin, as we might say today, but to speak Latin, because Latin is a spoken language in antiquity, and that's what you mainly think about, is speaking it. The teacher gets him to promise to pay attention, so he's encouraging sort of real cooperation from the student, not just tuition money. There will be tuition money paid, education's not free, but that's not what he asks for up front. What he asks for is a person paying attention. And then when the student agrees, we start the lesson with reading a book. Okay, so the first task is reading aloud, and the child reads aloud, working out where the words divide because there's no spaces between the words. And then at the end of that lesson, he moves on then to other exercises. Now, this idea that we have stories about how people learned languages is really valuable for us, because these are not only the textbooks they use, but they contain in them a description of language learning. So we can really find out from them what people did. So if you look at passage 3 on the handout, I'm afraid we're back to another 12th century manuscript there, so the Greek is a bit hopeless again, but have a look at the Latin. Here is somebody who comes to school with his own personal slave boy. That's quite common, because it's the father gets the slave boy educated for free by sending him to school with the son. So the boy is officially there to carry the son's school equipment. So the free boy doesn't have to carry anything when he goes to school, the slave boy carries it. But then while he's there, the slave boy gets an education. It's not such a bad deal. And we find out what the boy brings to school by what he gets handed when he gets there. He gets handed writing tablets and a case of styluses. And the first thing he does is erase his writing tablet. So I've got here as well a replica writing tablet. It's made out of wood and it's covered with colored beeswax. And you write on it with a stylus, which looks like this. So you write with the pointy end, and then you erase it, which is what the first thing that he does, because he doesn't bother to erase his lesson when he finishes it the previous day. He erases it when he wants to reuse the tablet. You erase it with this end of the stylus. And I'm going to pass this one around as well. You're welcome to try writing on it, try erasing it, but 2 tips. When you're writing, don't press very hard, because if you do press very hard, it will be impossible to erase it. I mean, I will go take it home and I will heat it up. You heat these things up with a candle and then you can sort it out, but it will mean that the other people in the room can't practice writing on it. And also, when you are erasing, don't hold the stylus like this, because that will gouge the wax. So he starts out with erasing his tablet, and then he writes his exercise, and he shows it to the teacher, and the teacher corrects it. And then he reads from the book, and he doesn't own the book, the teacher owns the book. And so he passes it, each student who comes up to read does the reading, because these things are expensive in antiquity. It took me 4 days to make that one, and that's not as long as a real one. If it were a real one, it would have taken me about a week. Now, okay, I'm slow because I'm a modern person, not an ancient scribe. Maybe an ancient scribe could have done a real one in 4 days, but still, they're expensive because they take a long time to make. And then we get, at the very end of this passage, something that's really interesting for us, where he says, edisco interpretamenta redidi. The reason that's really interesting is that interpretamenta, the Greek hermenumeta, is the name for these texts. So interpretamenta or hermenumeta means a bilingual text in columns like this. So he's talking about what he's doing with his elementary language textbook. And that's useful for us, because when I first started working on these, I couldn't imagine what you actually did with them. Because when I teach Latin, I give my students a text in Latin. And I ask them to read it and understand it and translate it. And you can't do that if you give them a translation to begin with. So when I saw these bilingual texts, I said, what did they do? What are you actually doing in an ancient Latin class? And the answer is, you are reciting from memory the Latin column. So you learn the Latin column by heart, and you can recite it to prove that you know it. The Greek column makes sure that you understand it, because there's not a lot of point in your memorizing it if you don't know not just what it means, but what all the different words in it mean, so that you can then use those words meaningfully. Redidi, that last word in this passage, is a technical term. It means to hand in your assignment in whatever form the assignment is supposed to be handed in. So if you have a writing assignment, you write out something on your tablet, and then you hand the tablet to the teacher. That act of handing your tablet in is redidi. If you have a reading assignment and you are supposed to learn to read a passage, and you come up with this book and you read the passage aloud, that act of reading to show that you can do it is redidi. And if you have a memorization assignment, you're supposed to memorize something, when you come up and you recite it from memory to prove that you know it, that's redidi. So that's what they're doing with these texts. Now, of course, you can't stay a beginner forever. Even for them, there comes a time when they are not using a translation anymore. And this manuscript will tell us what they do at that point. So this is passage 4. And for once, the Latin and the Greek are lining up. And it tells us what an advanced student is doing. So he's sitting down and he's going through the commentary and the word lists and the grammar. He must be preparing a text. It doesn't actually say that he's got a text, but you're not going to use a commentary, word list, and a grammar together unless you've got a text. And then he's called up to do a reading, and the teacher explains some things to him. He explains the meanings, and he explains the persons. That's to say, who's talking, because that bit about it not being written in an ancient text, who says what, of course, as a child at school, you have to learn how to work out who says what. And he's a little child, he doesn't know it yet, so the teacher is explaining to him who says what. And then the teacher asks him grammatical questions. And grammatical questions has a wider meaning in antiquity than it does now. So we get 2 questions. One of them is, what part of speech is it? Well, that's something that we would call a grammatical question. The other one is, to whom is he speaking? We would call that a question of interpretation, not a question of grammar. But in antiquity, the term grammar includes that as well. And then he declines nouns, he parses verses. So we have a really good set of descriptions of what language learning is in these texts. But we might wonder, what did that actually mean? What did they do when they declined a noun? Did they do the same things that we do, or did they do something else? And that's where we want to look at the actual remains of ancient school documents. So that is a table of noun declensions from Antiquity. And you can see that actually they did do something very similar to what we do when they were declining nouns. That's the bit I'm going to blow up. That's number 5 on the handout. And it's a paradigm of ichor. So it says at the top in red, neuter nouns in or, and it says it in Latin. Because although this was intended to be used by a Greek speaker, in antiquity, the idea is the framework of your grammar is in the same language as the grammar itself. So any grammar of Latin is in Latin. Any grammar of Greek is in Greek. There's only one exception to that, which we're going to see a bit later. They don't have the idea that you could describe one language in another language, which also made it very hard, I think, for learners because they had to, cope with the grammar of Latin in Latin. There's just 2 bits of Greek on this text. One is the page numbers, and the other is that. That says the sea in Greek. So ichor means the sea. You give the Latin paradigm, and then it's translated into Greek so that the student knows what it means. And then it's declined. So you get the nominative, then you get the genitive, then you get the dative, then you get the accusative. And over here, what you've got is forms of hic, haec, hoc. The reason why we have forms of hic, haec, hoc is because that's a shorthand for telling you what gender, number, and case your form is. So huius can only be genitive singular. You could say genitive singular, but it's shorter to say huius. You could say dative singular, but it's shorter to say huic. And then for the vocative, they say o, because that is the vocative particle. There is no vocative of hic, haec, hoc. We've also, in antiquity, got dictionaries. We've got 3 different kinds of dictionaries. So that is a dictionary in alphabetical order. It is a dictionary alphabetized by the first 5 letters of each word. So if you look at those letters, you'll see that up through the 5th letter, we're in alphabetical order. From the 6th letter onwards, the order is random, because alphabetization in antiquity normally doesn't mean full alphabetization. It's just kind of close. We're actually quite lucky that it's 5 letters here. Some of them are only alphabetized by 1 letter. You'll also see there are mistakes. So in the first line, the Latin says extrudat. That should be extrudat. But I haven't changed it on the handout because this is an ancient mistake. By definition, this is an ancient text, it's an ancient mistake. When you're doing an edition of a medieval manuscript, you assume that the mistakes happened in the Middle Ages, and so you take them out when you produce an edition. But with a papyrus, you know the mistake was there in antiquity, and it's relevant to the question of ancient Latin learning that that kind of mistake is there. Then we've also got another kind of dictionary. That's this one. That's a dictionary of words in the order that they occur in a text. So it's a kind of running word list for a text. And the text is a section of Book 4 of Virgil's Aeneid. And if you look at that, you'll see a number of things. You'll see that it's been corrected by another person. So there are corrections which are made by somebody who's not the same as the person who did the original writing. The person who did the original writing made a lot of mistakes. The person who corrected it corrected some of it, but there are still some quite nasty mistakes in there. And that tells us more about ancient Latin learning. They're reading a text of Virgil. They always start out prose. Prose with Cicero, verse with Virgil. Some things don't really change. But they don't have very good tools for reading Virgil. It must have been extremely difficult. Not even the Latin text is right. So that ought to be a past tense. But it sure looks like a future tense there. If you look over on passage 8 on the handout, I've given you the text of Virgil with the words that are glossed underlined. And you can see that the person who did this dictionary has done something besides simply picking out hard words. They've also put things together. So, revoluta est in the first line. Those are not next to each other in Virgil's text, but they belong together. Revoluta est is fundamentally one verb. You translate it with one verb in Greek, you translate it with one verb in English. I don't know how many words you use for Russian, but if it's 2 words, they're closely connected. It is fundamentally one idea. And so the person who did this glossary has put them together, and that by itself helps the reader. But there are also problems with the way this has been done, because if you look further down, you get artus and merita put together. Now those don't go together. But the person who did this glossary honestly thought they went together, because here it's almost invisible, but there's a little accent on that alpha. And that accent tells you that the alpha is a neuter plural, and it agrees with mele, which I understand Elena has rendered in the Russian translation of this passage. So you have actually, it was intentional to put those 2 words together on the same line. The person who did it thought they agreed with each other, but they don't agree with each other in Latin. Merita is a nominative singular, and artus is an accusative plural. It is really not at all something that should go together. But it's a mistake rather than simply not thinking. And we've actually got also a third kind of glossary, which is a glossary of words organized by topic. These papyrus is much earlier than the others I've shown you, and that's not an accident. This is the earliest kind of bilingual glossary that we find. And if you look more closely, you'll see something else that's different about it, which is that the Latin is in Greek script. It's in the Greek alphabet. So that is the column that is Latin. And That's something else that you get in the early papyri. They don't yet learn the Latin alphabet. They haven't worked out yet that it would be a really good idea to learn the Latin alphabet if you're learning Latin. And they try to do it in transliteration. And by the 3rd century, they've worked out that this is not such a great idea, and they do it in Greek. So this is the section on the winds, and you have a little heading at the top. It says about winds. Sorry, most of it's missing, but it did say about winds. And then you have words pertaining to winds, such as wind itself and the names of the various winds. And then they had, of course, grammars in the sense of explanations of syntax. Now, I don't have a really good picture of papyrus for that one, so we're going to go back to the manuscripts, and that's the manuscript for passage 10. And if you look at the handout, passage 10 is in the same narrow columns as everything else, but that manuscript isn't. And that's because this manuscript has had the columns run together to save space. So the passage on the handout starts here. So Latin, Greek, Latin, Greek, Latin, Greek, Latin, Greek, Latin, Greek. Turning the page, in the middle of the word, there's the other half of the Greek word for accusative. That's practically impossible to read. So I put it back into columns on the handout, and I'm sure it was in columns originally. The other thing that's really interesting about this passage is that as an explanation of case usage, it's kind of lopsided, because he tells you that there are 6 cases, and he tells you the names of the 6 cases, and then never again will he mention the nominative, the genitive, the dative, the accusative, or the vocative, because Dositheus is writing for Greek speakers, and they know how to use those cases. The ablative, however, Latin's got it, and Greek doesn't. So this is only the beginning of a very long discussion of the ablative. He goes on and on and on. I didn't put the whole thing on the handout. The handout is only this passage, but he goes on for like 3 pages about the ablative. Because Greeks were really confused about what to do with a Latin ablative. So the grammar is very, very focused on what that kind of learner needs. This, by the way, is that one exception. Remember, I told you earlier that grammars of Latin are always in Latin, grammars of Greek are always in Greek. Dositheus is the one person who thought, this is hard on students, this is unfair. And so he didn't write his grammar in Greek, but he provided a running translation of his grammar in Greek so that people could understand what he was saying when they were just starting out. And then we have evidence for what they do when they prepare a text, putting all of this together. So I'm sorry that's not a great photograph, but it's the best one there is. This is a papyrus of Sallust. Not what you read at the beginning. That's true now as well. I did Sallust as a student, but I didn't do it in my first year or my second year. It's something you do when you're more advanced. And in Antiquity, you're doing Sallust after you have graduated from the bilingual phase, when you are preparing your text with your commentary and your dictionary and your grammar. So this was originally a monolingual Latin text of Sallust. That line there is written in Latin. I know it doesn't really look like Latin script. You might just have to trust me, that is Latin. That line there is written in Latin. That's Latin. That's Latin. That's Latin. But somebody has looked up the hard words in a dictionary and written them in. I don't know whether you guys do that when you're preparing a passage, but my students certainly do. They look up the words in the dictionary and they write the English in over the hard words. So that's Greek, and that's Greek, written in over the words that it translates. And this student has also done something else. He's added punctuation. So that, and that, those dots are punctuation not written by the original writer, but written by the person who wrote the Greek. And the student has also added long marks, macrons. So that one is a macron, that one is a macron, and that one is a macron. And those are all on E's. On the back of the papyrus, you'll find some more on E's and also some on O's. They don't care about A, I, and U, whether those are long or short. Because in Greek, you have a different letter for long and short E, and a different letter for long and short O, but the same letter for long and short A, and for long and short I, and for long and short U. So when Greeks are reading Latin, they don't mind about A, I, and U, but with E and O, they get unhappy if they can't tell whether it's long or short. So they frequently mark the quantities, but only of those letters. So what you've got is a student who's preparing to read it aloud and to translate. We know they're preparing to read it aloud because of the long marks and the punctuation, and we know they're preparing to translate because of the Greek words written in. So we can see that what the hermeneumeta says about what the students do is in fact what they were really doing. And lastly, just for fun, I'd like to tell you one other way you can find out which of the ancient teaching methods really work, and if so, how they work. And that's by trying them out. And every year at Reading, in my university in England, we have an ancient school day. And so we reconstruct for one day an ancient schoolroom, and we invite local school children to come and find out what it was like going to school as a Roman, not only using the papyri, using the wax tablets, and what they particularly enjoy, using the pieces of broken pottery to write on, but also what it's like doing the ancient exercises and finding out what that other way of learning is like. So, I understand there's 10 minutes for questions, and I really hope somebody's got some questions.